Hi and welcome to the Peak Endurance Podcast. This episode is an interview with Andy Blow. Andy is a sports scientist with a degree in sports and exercise science from the University of Bath. An expert in sweat, dehydration and cramping, Andy previously worked as the team sports scientist for the Benetton and Renault Formula 1 teams and remains an advisor to the Porsche Human Performance Centre. An elite level triathlete in his younger days, Andy has finished in the top 10 of Ironman and 70.3 races, as well as winning an Xterra World title. It was Andy's own struggles with cramp and hydration that led him to specialising in electrolyte replenishment and finding precision hydration. Andy is a leading figure in the world of sports hydration and has worked alongside other top sports scientists to co-author a number of studies and books. Do you have injuries or niggles ruining your enjoyment of running and hindering your performance? Running is meant to be an enjoyable, yes, even when you're doing speed work, and stress-relieving activity. But it's not when it hurts for all the wrong reasons. Come in and see the specialists at Health and High Performance. They can utilise the latest in technology and experience to help you achieve the results you want and are capable of. So, head on over to healthhp.com.au/run or check them out on Instagram, Health High Performance. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. Rating, reviewing and sharing helps more people find the podcast and grows the audience, which all helps when I'm contacting people to be interviewed. You can also go to my YouTube channel, as you have now, to see the video recordings of all of the podcast. Please subscribe. Make sure you check out the show notes for links to the articles we talk about in this interview and for a 15% discount on precision hydration products. I've tried them myself and I have to say I really like them, and I'm not just saying that. The taste is not overpowering, which to me is super important. There is also a link in the show notes to book a free video chat with one of the experts at Precision Hydration, and they can help you with your hydration needs. In next week's episode, I chat with Sean Bell. Sean is an amazing young man who plans to run around Australia in 2022 to raise funds for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Be sure to check it out. With so many restrictions in place, it's more important than ever to have a structured and individualised plan to ensure you maximise your training. Races will eventually return in time, but in the meantime, there are many other challenges that you can find to train for. And also just being ready for when the races come back. If you need an individualised plan, email me, isabel@peakendurancecoaching.com.au to chat about a plan. Have a great week of training, stay safe and well, and remember, with a little kindness, grace and empathy, we will come out the other side of this mentally stronger and way more resilient. Enjoy the interview with Andy. Hi, Andy, and welcome to the Peak Endurance Podcast.
Hi, Izzy. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no worries. Now, can you just tell the listeners a bit about yourself, your athletic background, and how part of your athletic background motivated you to start with precision hydration?
Yeah, for sure. It's an important part of it for me, really, because a lot of what we do with precision hydration now is based on what I learned solving problems for myself as an athlete, because I was a competitive triathlete back in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And when I moved up from short course racing to long course stuff, I had quite high expectations of doing really well, and then sort of came crashing back down to earth as soon as I did my first Ironman, which was in Switzerland in 2000. And it was very, very hot. And my performance was awful. And I was cramping and walking on the run and generally hating life. And that kind of repeated, that was a pattern that repeated itself in lots of long hot races for me. And it took me many years to figure out that it was to do with hydration, how much I was sweating, how much electrolyte I was losing, and that I was just getting all of that completely wrong. And that was the stimulus really to sort of look into all of this and get started with precision hydration.
Now, when you were doing those races, and did you realize at first that's what the problem was, or were you trying to look down different avenues trying to solve that problem?
I think I was looking at it from all sorts of angles, and I had an inclination it was something to do with hydration and sweating, because it was always pretty obvious that I had a high sweat rate. I am that guy that's got a soaking wet t-shirt after a few minutes of running, or I've rusted through loads of bikes stems on my turbo trainer because it just pour with sweat.
Oh wow.
So I was always pretty clued into the fact that maybe hydration was an issue for me, but sort of growing up in sport and studying sport in the 1990s, the prevailing wisdom in general was that drinking more was better because dehydration was a big problem. And clearly what was happening for me a lot of the time was I was actually over drinking, in trying to overcompensate for what I was losing in fluid loss, and at the same time not really fully cognizant about the fact that I was losing a lot of electrolytes in sweat and not replacing those. So it was probably a case of imbalance for me as much as anything else.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And it's kind of almost gone full circle from where you said that it used to be the focus was on drinking, a lot is now, with Timothy Noakes' idea of drinking to thirst. And certainly most athletes I know, and I've been guilty of this in the past too, is just going into a race and thinking, I'll just drink whatever, and whatever happens, happens. What's the viewpoint on that situation now?
Well, like you say, historically things have been very different. It sort of it was the case that many years ago athletes were advised to drink very little or nothing during competition. It was almost seen as like a weakness if you drank, and you should try and minimize it, and you had to tough it out. And that was probably the case right up until the 50s, 60s, maybe even the 1970s. And then in the 80s, things started to change, and there was this big amount of research done in sports hydration, a lot of it led by the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. And a lot of the evidence started to point to the fact that obviously at first, if you gave athletes more to drink, if you didn't make them abstain from fluids, then their performances improved, which is probably, dare I say it, a little bit obvious and quite basic, that if you force athletes to run long distances or cycle a long way without drinking, they're probably going to suffer at some point. But then what happened was that kind of got extrapolated, and you mentioned Tim Noakes, and his argument is that got blown out of proportion because the sports drink industry came along and sort of grew up, and it was and is in their interest to promote the fact that dehydration is bad and that drinking lots of sports drinks is good. And I think he makes a very valid point that the science was probably a little bit misinterpreted, and marketing messages got layered over the top of it, and we started to get this thing where hydration was the be all and end all, and that if you weren't drinking loads, then that was going to be problematic. And as I say, when I studied sports science in the 90s, the prevailing message was drink, basically as much as you can. And there was no sort of ceiling on that necessarily, or it didn't appear that there was. It was the underlying message was to drink more, and that would be better for you. And of course, what then started happening, as Noakes pointed out, was that people started getting hyponatremia in races, and hyponatremia is where you dilute the salts down in your blood to such an extent that you cause a cascade of other catastrophic problems. And quite often, you start off feeling just a bit ill and headachy and lethargic and maybe losing concentration and coordination, but that can progress, and sometimes people actually die from hyponatremia because their brain absorbs so much water it swells up and crushes on the inside of the skull, and you get real devastating problems. So it is a nasty thing, and what Noakes did brilliantly was highlight this problem. He did a lot of research in that area and sort of promoted the idea that actually, if we're a bit more sensible and just listen to our bodies and drink when we're thirsty, then we won't get hyponatremia. Because the way thirst works in the body is predominantly for athletes, when you sweat out a lot of water and some electrolytes, but you sweat out less electrolytes than are in your bloodstream. So you basically lose more water than salts. And so as you sweat, your blood gradually becomes more concentrated. So the salt levels relatively in your blood rise, and then you drink a little bit, it dilutes it back down. And it's that rising salt level in your blood that drives thirst. So the theory, therefore, is if you drink when you're thirsty, you'll continue to replenish and you'll be fine. And I have to say, for the majority of the time, certainly in day-to-day life, for most athletes doing short events or not training very much, that's really great advice. It's adequate advice. You can learn to listen to your body, tune into it, like you can with learning how to pace yourself, or learning, when you're feeling an injury coming on, you just tune into your body and you respond appropriately by drinking. Where that advice, I think, though, falls down a little bit is when you start to get into longer and hotter events, when the salt loss and the electrolyte loss in sweat, if it's not compensated for in either what you're drinking or what you're eating alongside fluids, means that eventually you'll either dilute the blood or your blood volume will contract so much and you'll get so dehydrated that your performance starts to suffer. And so I think that where we've gone from a simple message of don't drink anything to a simple message of just drink as much as you can, to this other like overly simple message of just drink when you're thirsty. And the just drink when you're thirsty one has some merit, but it's not the be all and end all, because especially when we're talking about the world of ultras and marathons and Ironman triathlons and things, there's a very strong case, I think, for having a more strategic approach and understanding a little bit more about electrolyte loss when it comes to hydration.
So do you believe that athletes should have a hydration plan, just like they have a pacing plan and a food plan and that sort of thing, nutrition plan?
I certainly do for longer and hotter races, but I don't think it's necessarily a plan that needs to be very, very rigid. I think what most athletes benefit from is understanding roughly how much sweat they're going to lose per hour during an event, which is a very easy test to do. There's actually a blog on our website you can click into and download a spreadsheet to put your details, and you basically weigh yourself before and after some runs and work out roughly what your sweat rate is. And what that helps you to do is calibrate the total volume of fluid that you might be losing. The other thing to understand is have an appreciation of how much electrolyte you're losing in your sweat, because that varies about tenfold between people. It's quite stable within an individual, but the variance between people is massive. And I learned the hard way about that, because as well as having a high sweat rate, my sodium levels in my sweat are really, really high. I lose about 1.8 grams of sodium per litre of sweat.
Oh, wow.
Some people lose as little as 200 milligrams in every litre. So they're like 9 times less than I am. And we see that whole range. The highest person we've ever tested lost over 2,000 milligrams of sodium in a litre of sweat. So everyone, if you just have it, and the good thing about this is you don't need to understand necessarily the exact number that you lose. You just need to appreciate whether you're someone who loses a little bit, a sort of normal amount, a high amount, or a really high amount. And then
how do people know how much they lose without getting a test, for instance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if athletes have done a lot of training and competing in the heat, if they lose a lot of salt, they often have an inclination that they do. For me, it was like, a black running hat is a great thing to look at, because if you sweat out a lot of salt, if you're wearing black clothing, you'll often see white salt stains on it, like tide marks. And I'm sure you've seen those on people's kit and on their packs in long races. You'll find that if your sweat's very salty, it will sting in your eyes, and feel, and it will, if it drips, down your lips into your mouth, it will taste very salty. So if you exhibit some of those signs, as well as maybe just generally feeling a bit crappy in the heat, maybe like I was, underperforming compared with your fitness level when it's very, very hot, lots of those things can be signs that you're losing a bit more salt than average. And then you can, one of the things that we do as a company is obviously offer sweat testing, so people can test their sweat and get an accurate an accurate answer. Yeah. But even if you can't get it tested, if you play around with different concentrations of electrolytes in your drinks or with your drinks, you can very much trial and error your way to figuring out what kind of ratio works for you. And then that means when you go into a race, your plan is not like a plan which you're going to tick off, minute by minute, hour by hour, exactly how many milliliters of fluid and grams of sodium, but it means that you've got a ballpark for what you should be roughly taking per hour based on past experience.
Things always happen in races that can change it, but at least you've got a sort of a guideline, I guess. Yeah,
because I was actually listening the other day to your podcast with Ricardo Costa, who talked a lot about nutrition and the individual variance in that, and that really struck a chord with me, because I remember you asking him a question about I've done this in one race in nutrition, and then I do the same thing in another race, and it doesn't work the same. And that's the intriguing thing about sport and races, is although they're kind of similar, often they're not exactly the same. And we classically see that with athletes when you go from, say, competing through the winter, and then the first kind of big race of the summer comes along, and you're not really acclimated to the heat, and the weather's maybe you get unlucky and there's a bit of a spike in temperature and it's a lot hotter than it has been. It's quite hard to sometimes adjust your nutrition hydration plan if you've not got a lot of experience to draw on, because everything you've just done in the last 6 or 8 weeks building up in training is now going to need to change a bit. So it's having those parameters in your head. Okay, roughly how many milliliters of fluid an hour can I generally cope with, or how many do I need? How many milligrams of sodium? And then what I talk to athletes all the time about is keeping this kind of mental ledger in a race of looking back over the last hour or two and thinking, how much have I taken, or how much have I drunk? Because if your performance starts to dip, you can then go back and retrospectively analyze in your head, okay, well, I think actually I've been underdoing the fluid. Because I should have been drinking normally about 700 milliliters an hour, and I've only been doing 300 or 400. But the thing is, if you think you should have been drinking about 700 and you've already been doing 900, putting more fluid in is probably not a good idea. And that was the mistake that I classically made in a race, was as soon as I started feeling crappy, be like, more fluid, more calories. And you just keep piling it in. And that can be a real issue. GI upset, hyponatremia. Yeah. You've just got to be sensitive to the body and understand that more is not always better.
Yeah. And pardon me. So what's the difference then with your products that makes it, because just pouring more water in, like you said, can create more problems. And some of the Gatorade drinks, well, certainly I've had them previously and they've just made me feel sick. So what are the differences with your products then?
Well, sports drinks, when they first came out in the 80s and 90s, were designed usually to be what's called isotonic. So isotonic means they have a similar thickness, a similar density to your blood, with the idea being that you were trying to replace 3 things with a sports drink: fluids that you lose in sweat, calories in the form of carbohydrates, and some salts in terms of electrolytes. And so a typical sports drink is usually about 6 to 7% carbohydrate in solution, which makes it reasonably syrupy. They usually have about 4 to 600 milligrams of sodium per litre. And then obviously the volume of fluid is dictated by the amount that you drink. But basically that makes them a kind of, we call them like a jack of all trades product. They're trying to replace calories, fluids and electrolytes all in one. And in certain circumstances, they can work quite well. But what we try to do for people, especially in hotter climates or doing longer races, is look at electrolyte needs on an individual basis. The strongest drink that we make is called pH 1500. And that contains 1500 milligrams of sodium per litre. So it's about 3 times the strength of like a standard isotonic drink. But rather than having lots and lots of carbohydrate in it, we make one which has no carbohydrates at all, or we make another one which has a very small amount of carbohydrate. So it's about a 2.9% solution. And they're what's called hypotonic. So their tonicity, their thickness is lower than that of your blood, which means that even if you're drinking quite large quantities of them, they tend to move through the stomach, into the gut and into the bloodstream a lot faster, a lot easier. So you get less risk of that GI distress. So that, and then the other drinks that we make are varying strengths of electrolytes. So we basically make a 500 milligram strength, 1,000 milligram strength, and a 1,500. And the key thing then is kind of matching the closest fit to you as an individual based on your sweat rate, your sweat sodium concentration, and probably the duration of the event as well.
Yeah. And like you said, you can estimate all that sort of stuff from doing the sweat testing, filling the spreadsheet out. And would you recommend doing that one over a number of different runs under a variety of different conditions and that sort of thing?
Yeah, always, if you can, because the more data you can build up there, we're not looking for an exact figure. It's sort of, you go out and do a run on a hot day at a set pace and then run at the same pace on a cold day, you'll see the variance, you'll see the difference. And just by building up a database of that and then comparing that to what the normal rates are, you can start to figure out if you're someone who's lower on the scale, medium or high. As an example, it's quite often quoted that an average kind of adult human sweat rate during endurance exercise is about 1 litre per hour.
Yeah.
But the range around that figure is huge. The average might be about 1 litre, and I don't think that's probably far off the mark, but you will definitely see people in cold conditions who are losing a negligible amount of fluid per hour. And we've seen athletes losing over 3 litres an hour in hot conditions. Yeah. So that average is kind of useful as a guide, but what it is useless for is if you take that average and say, well, I reckon I'm about average, and actually you're up at 2.5 litres an hour. Yeah. Then I can't remember who said it, but there was a quote that someone shared with me a little while ago about the guy whose average temperature is pretty good, but he's got his head in a fridge and his feet are in the oven. And you sort of, that describes it really well, because although the average is the average, the extremes are quite wide. And what you've got to try to understand is whether you're someone who sits closer to one end or the other.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Now, when we're hydrating during an event, are we trying to replace everything that we've lost?
Almost certainly not, I would say. That used to be it makes sense, doesn't it? If you sweat 1 litre per hour, that you would intuitively think, well, I'll put 1 litre per hour back in and I'll be in equilibrium. But generally, when studies have been done on large groups of athletes, especially successful athletes doing well in endurance events, because we hopefully start those races really well hydrated, we do have an amount of dehydration that we can tolerate. And again, this is a huge point of contention and argument between sports scientists, but some people say your performance will start to suffer after 1 or 2% of body weight loss. Other data suggests that elite marathon runners can finish races 6, 7 or 8% dehydrated with no sign in performance decrement. I would say that generally, somewhere in the middle ground seems to be relatively true for most people. If you are much more than 2 or 3% dehydrated, you're probably going to start to feel it and start to suffer. But really what it comes down to is making sure that you're getting enough fluid in to mitigate what you're losing, but definitely not aiming for 100% losses. Yeah. And actually that's where the Tim Noakes thing comes back in.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough.
Sorry, I lost you a second.
I was saying it would be hard work to fully replace all the liquids anyway.
Absolutely, yeah, and we do see studies that demonstrate if people maintain their body weight at the end of a race, or even sometimes gain weight during an ultra or an Ironman, they're the ones that are susceptible to hyponatremia and tend not to perform very well as well. So I think a level of dehydration is very much sort of almost necessary for top performance, if you see what I mean.
Well, and often as when you come into a race, you're fully stocked up with everything, fully loaded with, you've eaten plenty, you've drunk plenty, so you're going to tend to lose something anyway, aren't you?
Yeah, definitely. Whenever I've stood on the start line of an ultra or an Ironman or something, I've tended to be a kilo or 2 heavier than I was in the preceding week, because I've had all that extra carbohydrate, extra salt, extra fluid, and you want to start with that reserve to burn off. So yeah, you definitely will be losing some weight throughout.
Now, you talked about starting an event fully hydrated. So what should an athlete focus on to make sure that they're, properly hydrated at the start line?
Yeah, good question. The prevailing wisdom, or not the prevailing wisdom, but the attitude that a lot of athletes had, and I definitely put myself in this camp, earlier in my career, was that in the week before the event, you sort of treat yourself as if you become a camel and you start just piling water in, and we all walk around with a water bottle nervously sipping away because we don't want to start dehydrated. And the thing with that is, where we can store, for instance, quite a bit more carbohydrate before an event in your liver and in your muscles, if you eat more, with fluid, your body's really good at regulating the amount of fluid in your body. So if you put a bit extra in, there's sometimes a small capacity to be extra hydrated, if you like, but it's very small, because if you just start drinking more, you just start peeing more. So what athletes I've seen do all of the time is drinking more in the days before a race. Then their pee starts to become quite pale or quite clear. And they take that as a good sign that I'm really well hydrated. So they keep topping up and they keep peeing. And what happens then is you kind of set this circular reaction in where you drink more, you wee more, you lose electrolytes, and you actually can start to the process of diluting your body down a little bit before you even get to the start line. So there's a chap, a researcher, Dr. Stavros Kavouras, he's Greek, but he's based in Phoenix in Arizona, and he's studied this kind of thing a lot. And he studied the Spartathon race in Greece and took blood samples from the competitors at the start line, and was, I think, pretty amazed to see that 10% of them were already showing signs of hyponatremia before the start.
Oh, wow.
Which you wouldn't necessarily, well, you wouldn't expect to see if you just got a bunch of 10 runners, any day of the week and pulled them into a lab and tested their blood. I don't think you'd expect to see 10% of them showing signs of hyponatremia. So he's hypothesized that actually maybe this is because a lot of athletes are nervous about this race. It's very long. It's like 250 Ks or something. It's extremely hot. What does everyone therefore do? They drink before they start. And so the advice generally is actually in the days before an event or a big training session, you have got to drink pretty well. You've probably got to drink normally, maybe plus a little bit, so making sure you're not running dry at any point, but don't go crazy. We're talking, when we say a little bit, it might be an extra glass or two of water with a meal or something. It's not like bottles and bottles of water extra. And then in the last 24 hours, what I recommend athletes to do is to drink a very strong electrolyte drink. So something which is at least 1,500 milligrams of sodium per litre, and have about half a litre of that the night before they go to bed if it's an early start. And if they can, another sort of half litre about an hour before the start. Because with the extra salts in that, there's a good proportion of that gets pulled into the bloodstream and held there, so that you actually boost your blood volume a little bit, and you don't end up just in the queue for the toilets before the race. You actually are sort of super hydrating it a tiny bit. But I think that it's probably more important. That's a good technique, but I think it's more important just to not over drink water, because that's the instinct, and that's what I see so many athletes doing wrong.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And one question I was having, is there any difference between males and females in regards to, the effect of electrolytes and sodium and those sorts of things?
That's an area that Dr. Stacey Sims has talked about a lot, in the fact that during the menstrual cycle, at different times, then female athletes tend to retain or excrete more sodium, which then affects fluid balance. And we were quite interested in that because obviously we were thinking, could it affect the recommendations that we make for female athletes during different times of the cycle? So Abby, who's our resident sports scientist at PH, did a bit of reading into it and found that although there's quite in what she found, although there's quite a bit of kind of clinical evidence to suggest that this is certainly not made up. There are differences at different times of the month with fluid retention and fluid excretion. The prevailing sort of thought from athletes and a lot of doctors working with them was that this wouldn't necessarily fundamentally change a hydration plan. The differences are statistical when you measure them, but they're maybe not clinically significant in terms of dictating what you would do with hydration. So our view on it to this point has been more to treat athletes, whether they're male or female, as individual in terms of their sweat rate, their sweat sodium composition, their rate of loss, and look to address it from that side rather than segregating it by male and female. So I mean, we work with a lot of female athletes, and I generally find that the prevailing wisdom with them is that they don't massively adjust their hydration plan based on the phase of the cycle that they're in. But I wouldn't, I certainly also feel very self-conscious about making recommendations in that area, because I don't have the personal experience to base it on. And so if there are female athletes that find that it does warrant some adjustment throughout the month, then I would say that's a very individual thing that probably needs to be looked at on an individual basis.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. Now, another thing, caffeine. So generally on the morning of a race, you'll have a coffee, and then athletes often take caffeine throughout a race. How does that affect their hydration levels?
The prevailing wisdom there used to be that caffeine is a diuretic, so it would probably result in a lot of fluid loss, and therefore should be avoided, or could be avoided before races. But actually, what the research tends to show nowadays is that if you are someone who has caffeine regularly, and if you start most days with a cup of coffee or two, then doing the same on race day is probably a good idea, because actually by abstaining from that, you sort of get more problems with the lack of the stimulant in the caffeine than you do from the fluid retention benefits. Because as you become habituated to caffeine consumption, your level tends to sit at a point where it doesn't affect fluid balance too negatively. So for me, I seem to be like probably a 2 to 3 coffee sort of person. If I have 2 or 3 coffees, I tend to have them earlier in the day. If I do that, my fluid balance tends to be totally fine. If I stray much beyond that, and I learn getting jet lag and drinking more coffee to try and sort of stay alert and stay awake, then I could get into a pretty negative spiral of the diuretic effect taking over and meaning I was getting quite dehydrated.
Yeah.
So I think, it's probably a good rule of thumb that if you generally start the day with caffeine, then to continue that in races. And during races, I don't think it's a problem at all. I think if you use it sensibly, it's a pretty powerful ergogenic aid for a lot of people.
Yeah. Now, you brought up jet lag there. In regards to, say, athletes who are travelling to races, and we all know how dehydrating aeroplanes are. I mean, back in the day when we could travel to races, and I'm sure we will again. What should athletes do when they're on a plane and travelling?
I think that similarly to the sort of preloading thing, if you're wanting to stay really well hydrated on a plane, the first thing is you're going to lose more fluid because of the dry air and the air conditioning. And certainly on long haul flights, that can be quite problematic, because even if you get on pretty well hydrated, you can get off feeling pretty dry if you don't top up. So I would say water, juice, and like stronger electrolyte drinks in moderation are probably the things to drink on board. I think part of the other problem with air travel is, for a lot of people, that it involves, especially if it's early starts, it involves drinking quite a lot of coffee or caffeinated drinks. People often enjoy alcohol on the plane. And I know that I've been, with the travel sometimes, especially when you're on an evening flight, it's nice to get on and have a glass of wine or whatever. But ultimately, you've got to really moderate that if you want to stay well hydrated, because that will exacerbate fluid loss, and then you're going to be in worse shape. So if you can be disciplined and stick to juice and water and electrolyte drinks, then you'll probably be better off.
Yeah. Now, also, there's a lot of controversy about what causes cramps. So there's the camp that says it's lack of electrolytes, and others who say it's pushing too hard. Where do you sit on that one?
Right in the middle. Because I don't like these polarized viewpoints, to be honest with you. There's too much of it, and I think that there has been, like with the drinking, don't drink as much as you can. With cramping, we've had cramping's about electrolyte and fluid loss, and then we've had this big swing towards cramping's not about electrolyte and fluid loss, it's about fatigue. And there's arguments, very, very strong arguments for both. And I think the anecdotal evidence around people losing a lot of sweat and losing a lot of fluid and electrolytes and getting cramping is overwhelming, especially when you look at then the intervention of giving people strong electrolyte drinks or salt with water to prevent cramps or treat cramps. It often works. And we probably get literally a handful of emails every week from like customers that have bought our stronger products who've been suffering with cramping in long races, who are so delighted that their cramps have either got so much better or gone away that they feel compelled to write to us. And we sort of love hearing those stories of people for whom it works. Every year we do what we call an annual cramp survey, where we reach out to a whole bunch of customers and we ask them for their experiences, pre and post using drinks. Because if people do a sweat test with us or an online test, they have to answer a question about whether they never, rarely, sometimes or often get cramps. And pretty much every year we find between 70 and 80% of people that adjust their electrolyte intake, make it more aggressive along with their fluids, find that it helps with their cramping. And although that's not scientific, and you could argue about all sorts of placebo effects and things like that in there, it's also mirrored in lots of other areas in which we work, and we hear lots of stories. And if you go back into the literature, there's tons of stories over the years of athletes solving their cramping problems by managing their electrolyte balance. But then if we've got that sort of 70-80% of athletes for whom that's helping, there is this 20-30% for whom this doesn't seem to help. And there's also kinds of muscle cramps that come on at weird times. We've had Ironman triathletes getting cramps in the swim, where there's no way you could pin that on electrolyte and fluid loss. You know, that's something different. You've seen track sprinters pulling up with cramps during 100 meters, or you do get cramps which just fail to respond to electrolyte intake in races. And I think that all of those things indicate that there's far more to it than that. And I think muscle damage, fatigue, inadequate pacing, or, you know, not being fully conditioned and trained for what you're doing, not sort of, you know, I find it can be in an Ironman triathlon. It used to be for me, getting cramps on the run was in the quads running downhill after they've been fatigued on the bike.
Yeah.
And that's probably at the same time as so they're getting very fatigued, but I'm also getting a little bit carbohydrate depleted. I'm getting a bit electrolyte depleted. And I think those things interact. And if you're someone who's prone to cramps, that's kind of a perfect storm. So we've got a really detailed blog on our website, which is one of the most read pieces we've ever written, all about cramping and sort of why it might happen, strategies to try for how to prevent it. So I think if anyone who's listening is interested in that, we could pop that in the show notes, because it's worth a dig into. And certainly they can reach out to us if they've got questions about that. Although quite often we end up suggesting to people they try adjusting their electrolyte intake because of what we do. We're not blinkered to the point of saying this is the only way or this is the answer. You know, there's lots of other things you can try. Sports massage is a big one for kind of, you know, sorting out damaged muscles, and stretching and pacing and all these kind of things all play a role.
Yep, no, that's fair enough. Now, you talked about the online test, which is different to the spreadsheet. Can you tell us a bit about that one?
Yeah, the online test started for us because not everyone could get to a physical test centre to have a sweat test done. Yet a lot of people wanted a recommendation on what products to use. So we devised this test, and we're constantly refining the algorithm that sits behind it in order to point people towards the fact or towards whether they're going to be someone who's got a low electrolyte requirement, a medium, a high, or a very high. So we ask in that survey questions about their cramping history, for example, whether they compete and train in hot environments, how long their competitions and training sessions are, what sport they do, all of that. And that all feeds in and then spits out a recommendation which kind of says, well, based on what you've told us, we think this is a good place to start with some trial and error. And that online test is totally free to do. You can just go to our website and hit the free hydration plan. It takes about 2 minutes to fill out, and then you'll get a couple of emails off the back of it with some suggestions. And then if you want to refine those or try things out, then you can always email us or jump on a Zoom call. We've got a sort of a program going at the moment, especially while people are not traveling so much and we're not getting out and about to see athletes, where you can book a one-to-one Zoom call with one of our team if you've got questions you want to follow up on.
That's excellent. Now, I've often heard that if you salt your food a lot, you'll end up being a salty sweater. Is that an old wives' tale, or is there some truth to that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's been researched a little bit, and the answers are quite inconclusive. I wouldn't go so far as to put it in the old wives' tale category, but because I think at the extremes, if you have a very, very high salt diet, there is some evidence to suggest that it can influence the amount of sodium in your sweat. But I think it's probably to quite a small extent, because the way the body regulates sodium is when you consume sodium, it goes into your bloodstream, and then your kidneys detect and either filter it out if there's too much, or they retain it if there's not enough. So mostly what you'll see if you eat lots of salt is you'll probably, if you measured it, you would see a lot of salt in your urine because you're just getting rid of it. Sweating is kind of downstream of all of that, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility that if you eat tons and tons of salt, then you would maybe be able to excrete more in your sweat because it's more available to the body. And they've certainly shown the opposite is true, that if you completely restrict sodium in the diet to a crazy extent where you're almost minimizing the intake completely, you can really reduce the amount of sodium in your sweat. The reason though, I think that's kind of interesting physiology, but I don't necessarily think it's super relevant to most athletes day to day, because very few athletes will eat a super ridiculous amount of salt or restrict salt completely. And most of us are in the middle ground where we eat a kind of whatever our normal daily intake of salt is. We probably eat a bit more than we need most of the time, and therefore we probably pee a bit out, but we don't influence it enough to massively deflect our sweat sodium. Because one of the theories about what drives sweat sodium loss is so the way sweating works is sweat comes from your blood plasma, and your blood plasma is very salty.
Yep.
It has about 3,600 milligrams of sodium in every litre. Now, by the time the sweat from your blood plasma goes into the sweat gland and exits onto the skin, your body's reabsorbed some of that sodium. So you end up with somewhere between sort of 200 and 2,000 milligrams of sodium per litre. And it's thought that this protein called CFTR, which activates channels in the sweat gland to reabsorb sodium and chloride, is responsible for how much you reabsorb. So for someone like me who loses quite a lot of sodium in their sweat, it could well be that CFTR function is kind of blunted and doesn't work very well compared with someone who has more efficient sweat glands that can reclaim a little bit more. And so I think the lion's share of what dictates how much salt you lose in your sweat is probably genetic. And then the rest of it is dictated by hormones and by salt in the diet, by acclimation status and those things.
And speaking of salt in the diet, is it like some athletes worth, before a long, hot session or race, eating some, in their pre-race food, something that's a bit salty as well?
I would say so, yeah. I certainly think, especially if you're someone who loses quite a lot, or like I was saying before, especially if you're someone who tends to underperform a little bit in the heat, it might be worth experimenting with either a strong electrolyte drink or a bit of salt on your food. And I don't think that'll do any harm. I think salt's been very much demonized in popular nutrition, potentially quite rightly for the majority of people who maybe radically overconsume it compared with what they lose. But when you look at the basic stats on some athletes, if I go out and train for 3 or 4 hours and I'm sweating out even a litre an hour, I could burn through 6 or 7 grams of sodium quite quickly, which is like 2 or 3 times the recommended daily allowance if I was to follow the government guidelines. So I don't think that the guidelines for low salt eating are particularly helpful for athletes who are sweating a lot.
Now, I wanted to discuss another one for you that I think is probably more, is definitely, I think, an old wives' tale. People who think that they can train themselves not to drink, which is almost reminiscent of that original theory where people said, oh, you don't need to drink. But people actually, I know, sometimes go out for training runs to train themselves to need less fluid. Is that possible?
Yeah, I'd say that you're right on that one, that largely that's a misconception, because your body can be trained to overcome a lot of, or it can adapt to a lot of stresses. But I think that dehydration is if you get thirsty, your performance is going to start to degrade, your quality of your training is going to start to degrade, and your recovery is going to be impaired. So I don't ever see a good argument for going out and training and deliberately dehydrating yourself, especially in sort of hot weather or conditions where you could get stuck out somewhere. It's actually potentially quite a dangerous thing to do. Yeah,
no, I agree. Now, you also mentioned recovery. How important is focusing on our hydration during the recovery aspect of our training?
I think it's absolutely massive in hot weather and in after sessions where you lose a lot of sweat. That was an area for me where until I sort of got on top of this as an athlete, it really hampered my ability to do things like train well twice a day in the summer, or even train hard on back-to-back days, because I would almost, after a long run or a long bike ride, wake up the next day sometimes feeling a little bit like I had a hangover, which was to do with the effect of the dehydration and salt loss. And I think if you it's all very well getting through one session on minimal fluid or minimal electrolyte intake, and you can probably maintain performance for a while on that. But if you don't then focus on, rehydrating effectively post exercise, then you're going to go into the next session or the next day on the back foot. And that's a big thing, especially in climates where you can be subject to some, quite like in Australia, where you can be subject to some quite extreme heat waves, which go on for a few days or whatever. That's then being on top of that hydration all the time, before, during, after those sessions, very, very important. And I think that often it's underrated, because as soon as you start talking to people about recovery, they just think protein or carbohydrate to restock muscles, both of which are very important. But getting your blood volume back up and sort of retaining your hydration status is also critically important, because if your blood volume's down, you're going to feel sluggish, and you're going to start that next session a little bit dehydrated, and then you're on the path to your performance dropping off.
Yeah, and we certainly don't want that. Is there anything else, any other tips or interesting thoughts that you would have that the listeners might want to hear?
I think the main one is that when it comes to hydration, like with many aspects of performance, I would really urge people to sort of look at this through the lens of their own experience, and to think of themselves as an individual. There's lots of guidelines out there around hydration, and lots of very extreme stories, and we've talked about a lot of them, a lot of oversimplified messaging around hydration. You should just do this, or you should just do that. And I think people need to try and block their ears out to that sort of noise and think about themselves as an individual, because hydration needs from person to person and from environment to environment are so vastly different. There is no way a simple one-size-fits-all answer can be applied. And that doesn't mean that this is all very complicated. It just means that figuring out roughly the amount of fluid, roughly the amount of electrolytes that work for you as an individual is your aim. And kind of close your eyes and ears to examples of what work for other people, because you might have a coach who's had an experience with this, and a lot of very good coaches are good at treating people as individuals. But I often see sometimes with coaches in certain areas, they'll have very definitive ideas because this is what worked for them. And I think as an athlete, if you're taking advice from someone which is like, this worked for me, so try this, it's like, well, hang on a minute, do my characteristics look like yours? Because if they don't, then it's not a great way to go. So I'd say just have the confidence and the sort of wherewithal to treat yourself as an individual in this dimension. Do a bit of trial and error, read up around the subject and inform yourself. And if you can get the right amount of fluid for you, roughly, and the right amount of salts for you when you're doing longer races, you'll find that you'll learn a lot, and you'll become very adept at managing it and getting the best out of yourself. And if I'd have had one piece of advice 20 years ago when I was trying to be serious as an athlete, that would have made a huge difference to me. And so that would be my main message now.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Now, I'll put your website in the show notes, but did you want to just tell people, if they're out on the run listening and they might possibly remember, just where they can go to get more information?
Definitely. It's precisionhydration.com is the place to find everything about us all. We're a team. We're a pretty small team. There's 10 of us, and you can email us on hello@precisionhydration.com. We love hearing from athletes and answering your questions and getting back to you. You can book one-to-one video calls with us at the moment, and I can give you the link to stick in the show notes on how to do that. There's also, we're on all the usual social media places, usually at Precision Hydration. The only one we're not is on Twitter. We're at the Sweat Experts. So you can give us a follow on that and DM us on those platforms if you want to. In Australia specifically, we've got a few different places where you can go for a sweat test. So we've got one on the Gold Coast. We've got one just outside of Sydney. We've got one going in Perth very soon. And we've actually, if people want to try our products and things like that, we actually ship them from warehouse either in Sydney or on the Gold Coast. So we're, although we're a UK sort of parent company, we're really, putting a good bit of infrastructure in Australia at the moment, for Australia and New Zealand, because we know there's a lot of athletes that want access to the products. So yeah, everything though goes through precisionhydration.com, and we would love to hear from you.
Yeah, well, I've been on the website, and I have to say the blog was was great. So many interesting articles, and I did the sweat test, and yeah, it's very lots of information that athletes would benefit from. So yeah, that's excellent. Thanks for that.
Cool.
All righty. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the chat, and yeah, thank you.
No, lovely to chat with you. And we'll have to get you sweat tested at some point, I think, Izzy, and find out what's going on with you.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. All righty. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.